InvestEngine recently announced their top 8 most bought ETFs in May, and in this video I want to go through each of them. For context, there's over 500 ETFs on InvestEngine, so these ETFs are extremely popular. They're the creme de la creme for investors on InvestEngine. And three of the 8 actually feature in my own portfolio, which you can check out in one of my other videos if you fancy it. But this video is all about the top 8 most bought ETFs on InvestEngine in May. So let's get straight into it. The first ETF is the Ishares Physical Gold ETF, and this is one of the ETFs I invest in my own portfolio. And I'm not surprised that this ETF features in the top 8 for two main reasons. Firstly, because it provides great exposure to precious metals as an asset class. And it's always a good rule of thumb to have diversification across different asset classes, and precious metals is of course one of the key asset classes. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is because precious metals tend to be extremely popular when there is market uncertainty. And given the recent tumble in the stock market, there is definitely heightened market uncertainty at the moment and over the last few months. Precious metals, and specifically gold, have traditionally offered a hedge to this uncertainty. So when the market tumbles, people tend to rush into gold as it's seen as a much more stable and safer asset. And this theory seems to be true again, as if we look at the value of gold over the last 6 months, we can see that this ETF has risen in value by over 11%. So since there's been market uncertainty and the general stock market has been tumbling, gold has been thriving. And a big reason why it's been thriving is likely because of what's been happening with the general markets and all the uncertainty. It's because of that people have rushed into gold, and this long-time traditional theory has proved true once again. And it's also likely that the huge inflation rates we're seeing contributed to this increase in popularity, increase in value in this gold ETF too. Since inflation rose by 9% in the 12 months to April in the UK. So by inflation I mean CPI measured inflation, which is the most used inflation measure in the UK. That recorded a 9% increase from April 2021 to April 2022 in the UK. And that's a huge increase, huge relative increase, given we've become used to seeing 2 to 3% inflation increases over the past 10 years, and now it's at 9%. And this huge inflation increase has also contributed to people rushing into gold more generally, as gold is seen as an inflation hedge, meaning that gold rises in line with inflation. So it's likely that investors have put more of their money into gold because of inflation, as well as the general market uncertainty. So overall, there's no surprise that this ETF, the iShares Physical Gold ETF, features in the top 8 at the moment. If the markets do pick up and inflation reduces, I wouldn't be surprised if this ETF falls out of the top 8 and we see more equity-centered ETFs taking its spot. But for now, with all the market uncertainty and high inflation, I can see why the physical gold ETF, iShares Physical Gold ETF, is in the top 8. So that's the first of the 8 most popular ETFs on InvestEngine in May. Next up, we're actually going to go through 3 ETFs at once. I'm going to group 3 ETFs together as they cover the same index. So Vanguard's, iShares and Invesco's S&P 500 ETFs all feature in the top 8 most popular ETFs on InvestEngine in May. ETFs tracking the S&P 500 tend to be some of the most bought ETFs every single year. It's almost a given. They provide exposure to the US stock market index, which tracks 500 large US companies, the Googles, the Amazons, the Apples, the Microsofts of this world. All the big US companies are tracked in the S&P 500. And the fact that 3 different ETFs covering this index feature in the top 8 really demonstrate how popular this index is. It's the go-to index for most people to invest in, given America is the biggest stock market in the world. Therefore, this index provides direct exposure to it. You get direct exposure to the biggest companies in the world by market cap, because they all sit in America, or most tend to sit in America. In fact, this index has a total market cap of over 36 trillion. That's absolutely huge. So there's no surprise that this index features in the top 8. However, maybe it's a bit surprised that there's 3 different ETFs tracking this index in the top 8. However, it is my opinion that this index is one which will always be in InvestEngine's top 8 most bought with one asset manager or another. And there's no surprise that in May, Vanguard and Ishares and Invesco were the most popular fund providers for this ETF, given they're absolutely huge fund providers. They're very well established. In fact, Vanguard and BlackRock's Ishares are the 2 biggest ETF providers in the world. So it's no surprise that out of all the different ETFs tracking the S&P 500, these 2 feature as some of the most popular. And these specific ETFs are very well funded too. Vanguard's S&P 500 ETF has over 23 billion invested in it. iShares S&P 500 has over 10 billion invested in it, and Invesco's S&P 500 ETF has over 9 billion too. So they're all extremely large funds, and you can see that's represented in their popularity. It's no surprise they feature in the top 8 because they are extremely well funded and popular, not just within InvestEngine, but with other platforms around the world too, other investors around the world, not just in the UK. However, the performance of S&P 500 tracked ETFs haven't been great over the past 6 months. If we take a look just at one of these ETFs, let's look at the iShares S&P 500. We can see that over the past 6 months, this ETF has gone down by over 12% in value. So it's gone down in value quite significantly over the past 6 months. And this reflects the general market uncertainty over the last 6 months and the general performance of economies. However, this performance over the last 6 months clearly hasn't put investors off, as it still remains one of the most popular ETFs on InvestEngine and more generally. 3 of the top 8 ETFs on InvestEngine track this index, and I think that's quite telling. The next member of the top 8 most bought ETFs on InvestEngine in May is Vanguard's Ftse Developed World ETF. And it's worth saying before we get into this that I'm going through these ETFs in no particular order in terms of what's the most bought and least bought of the top 8. I'm just going through as I see fit. So going back to this ETF, it's one of the most popular ETFs in recent years. It's a little bit more diversified than the S&P 500 ETF, as it's exposed to more developed markets outside the US, whereas the S&P 500 is only exposed to the US market. And it's also exposed to different market caps, mid caps, as well as large caps. There's over 2,200 mid and large cap companies tracked in this ETF compared to just 500 large caps in the S&P 500. So there's much greater diversification in the Ftse Developed World ETF compared to the S&P 500. And that's one of the main reasons why this fund has seen significant growth over the past few years, as it provides a means to get exposure to developed markets and different market caps across the whole world without needing to invest in several different regional specific ETFs. And the good thing about this ETF, I can see why it's one of the top 8, as you still get great exposure to the biggest stock market in the world, in the US. It still forms the US market, the majority of holdings in this ETF, with over 69% of the fund exposed to US holdings. And therefore a large proportion of the ETF is invested in America's biggest companies. For example, the biggest holding in this ETF is Apple, with 4.5% invested in this ETF. That's a huge proportion of the ETF invested in one single company, and that demonstrates the exposure to the US market is still very significant. But you also get exposure to Europe and the Pacific regions too, with Japan and the UK being the 2 biggest exposures outside of America. So you get great exposure across the developed world with this ETF, and for this reason there's no surprise that it features in the top 8. And although the performance of this ETF hasn't been great over the last 6 months, as we can see, it's quite similar to the S&P 500. It's gone down a significant amount. This reflects the general market uncertainty and the way economies have been performing. And it's important to look at the bigger picture. And you can see with the bigger picture, there's been huge growth over the last 6 years. The ETF has gone up over 70% over the last 6 years. So investors haven't been put off investing in this ETF simply because I assume they're looking at the bigger picture. This fund is great in terms of the bigger picture. It combines the best of the S&P 500 with added diversification across regions and a little bit of spice with not just large cap stocks also mid-cap stocks. So it's a great diversified ETF for developed markets. The next ETF is very different to the ones we looked at so far, and it has very different reasons for its spot in the top 8. And that's Vanguard's Ftse All-World High Dividend Yield ETF. This fund tracks the performance of stocks from the developed and emerging markets that pay dividends that are generally above average, higher than average. So this ETF is focused on companies which pay higher than average dividends in the developed and emerging markets. And it's the biggest all-world index focused on dividends of its kind. You get exposure to over 1,700 companies across the world who pay significant dividends. And some of the biggest holdings in this ETF include JP Morgan, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, so companies which you might not expect huge growth from in terms of equity value, but consistently pay high dividends. And currently this ETF pays 3.25% in dividends every quarter, which provides awesome passive income for investors in this ETF. And the passive income angle is one of the key reasons why this is extremely popular, particularly at the moment, as when markets tend to tumble and there's uncertainty, high dividend stocks and ETFs with high dividends tend to do better, as they tend to provide greater certainty in terms of their dividend return, and their equity value also tends to be more stable during times of market uncertainty compared to growth stocks. And you can see over the last 6 months, although this ETF hasn't grown in value, the decline has been nowhere near as significant as the S&P 500 ETFs we looked at or the Ftse Developed World ETF we looked at. The performance has been much better than those ETFs. Value and dividend paying stocks have not seen nowhere near as great falls as growth tech-heavy stocks, which tend to make up the biggest proportions of the S&P 500 and Vanguard Ftse Developed World. So I can see why this ETF has not seen as great falls, because it's made up mostly of those high dividend value stocks compared to the S&P 500 and Ftse Developed World ETFs, which are made up of the stocks which have seen the greatest falls. So there's extremely logical reasons why this ETF is more generally very popular, and particularly popular at the moment given the market uncertainty. So that's 6 of the 8 most popular ETFs on InvestEngine in May, and the 2 final ETFs actually feature in my own portfolio. So first up is the Ishares Msci Emerging Markets ETF. This ETF provides easy exposure to over 800 large and mid-cap companies in emerging markets, predominantly in China. That makes up the biggest percentage. And I can see why this ETF features in the top 8 and why it's likely to feature in the top 8 going forward. And that's because most investors tend to invest in a global index fund or a developed index fund, developed market index fund, or S&P index fund, and all these index funds are mostly exposed, if not all exposed, to developed markets. They typically don't include emerging markets. So I'm not surprised that this ETF features in the top 8, as by investing in this ETF, it enables index investors to get exposure to emerging markets and build that well-rounded, diversified portfolio across regions. This was my logic, at least, to why I invested in this ETF. I invested in an MSCI World Tracker Fund, which gave me exposure, great exposure, to the developed markets. However, it didn't give me exposure to the emerging markets, and I invested in this ETF to give me that extra diversification to emerging markets also. And although the performance of this ETF, as you can probably guess, hasn't been great over the last 6 months, this hasn't stopped this ETF being extremely popular and featuring in the top 8 most popular ETFs on InvestEngine in May. And the reason why it remains very popular is probably the same reasons why the S&P 500 and developed market ETFs remain popular. And that's the fact that investors who invest in these ETFs are looking at the bigger picture over the long term. And by looking at the bigger picture, they're wanting a well-rounded portfolio which also is diversified and exposed to emerging markets. And this is what this ETF enables. It enables you to get exposed to emerging markets and build a well-rounded portfolio across markets. So I would be very surprised if this ETF doesn't feature in the top 8 going forward. And the final ETF of the top 8 most popular features in the top 8 for similar reasons to the emerging market ETF. In my opinion, it's not an ETF you would invest 100% of your portfolio in. It's an add-on ETF to your portfolio to help build a well-rounded, diversified portfolio. And that's the iShares MSCI World Small Cap ETF. This ETF provides exposure to over 2,500 small cap stocks across the developed world. And the reason why this ETF is extremely popular is because it provides investors that means to get exposure to small cap stocks, which they don't get with the S&P 500 or Vanguard developed world ETFs or almost global tracker ETFs and tracker funds more generally. This is the means to get exposure to small cap stocks. And this is the exact reason why I invested in it too, to ensure I get exposure to small cap stocks, as my global tracker fund only focused on mid cap and large cap stocks. I don't think I need to go through the performance of this ETF over recent times, as it follows the same trend as the other ETFs we've looked at. Investors are investing in this ETF for the long term in the big picture. They're looking at the big picture and building a well-rounded, diversified portfolio for long-term returns. And on that note, that ETF forms the last ETF we're going to be looking at, the last of the top 8 most popular ETFs on InvestEngine in May. And as we've gone through, I think a theme has emerged. And that's the fact that all these ETFs are very focused on the long term and long-term returns. They're focused on building a well-rounded, diversified portfolio across regions, across market caps, and across assets. And the S&P 500, emerging markets, small caps, and gold all feature as the cornerstone of the most popular ETFs on InvestEngine. And these ETFs will be the cornerstone of most portfolios, I expect. Well, there will be, as that's how popularity works. There's a reason these ETFs are popular, because they feature in most portfolios on InvestEngine. And my portfolio definitely aligns with that theme of trying to build a well-rounded, diversified portfolio by featuring the developed markets, emerging markets, small caps, and precious metals in gold. So I can see why these ETFs are popular, and I can see this theme continuing in the coming months of these same group or types of ETFs featuring as the most popular. And if any of these ETFs feature in your portfolio, please let me know in the comments below. It'd be great to find out how you include these ETFs in your portfolio and whether the theme I think emerges from these ETFs is true with your portfolio. And if you want to actually invest on InvestEngine and are not currently a customer, it's worth saying that InvestEngine has a great deal at the moment, a great welcome offer, where you can get a £25 welcome bonus when you invest an initial £100, subject to T's and C's of course, but that's how it generally works. You invest £100 and you get a £25 bonus. So hopefully this video has given you some insight into the most popular ETFs and the theme which has emerged from these ETFs. Thank you.